This is the Hobbymate X130. It's a partial kit that includes the frame, motors, and ESCs, and it can get you started on building your first 130 size micro. Let's take a look. This is the kit as it comes from Hobbymate. You get your frame with standoffs for your flight controller, 20 amp ESCs, 1306 motors, 2 XT60 pigtails, a battery strap, and 2 full sets of props. To complete the build, you're going to need to provide your own camera, VTX and antenna, flight controller, and receiver. Let's take a closer look at the parts that come in the kit. The frame is a 130mm X style frame. The base plate is made of 3mm carbon fiber, so it is pretty strong. The camera pod itself is made of 2mm carbon fiber, so it should be pretty strong as well. The camera pod is designed to take a full-size FPV camera, and there is a spot in the back for a micro VTX. My only concern with the frame is that the flight stack is structural to the frame. So in a pretty bad crash, this might prove to be a bit of a problem. And as well, the top screws to get to the stack are hidden by the camera pod. So if you need to do any repairs, it's going to involve taking apart the entire camera pod to get to the stack. The included motors are 1306 3100 kV motors. They are probably okay on 3S, but I think they're better suited towards 4S. The build quality on these is quite high. They feel really nice, and every single one of mine turns really smoothly. The motors themselves do have directional caps, so this might be a bit of a disappointment to some people. But my only concern with them is that the wires on the motors are very, very thin. This won't be a problem for current. These motors aren't going to draw any more than 8 amps, but they might prove to be fragile in a crash. The Hobbymate ESCs are the smallest ESCs I have ever seen. They are rated at 20 amps, support up to a 4S LiPo, and run BL Heli S, so they support all the way up to D-Shot 600. The wires on the ESCs are all silicone as well, so they will make soldering quite enjoyable. The kit includes 2 complete sets of propellers. They are 30 by 30 tri-blades. They look good to me. And finally, there is a few odds and ends that you can use to complete your build. So there is a piece of Velcro that you can use to help hold your battery to the frame. There is a Velcro battery strap to cinch the battery down real tight. There is a little baggie of nylon standoffs that you'll use for mounting your PDB and flight controller. And finally, there are 2 XT60 pigtails. There's a male and a female. Male goes on the quadcopter. The female, I guess, is to replace on a battery, if you need to. Alright, let's get started with the build. I begin by laying out the motors in the proper orientation and dry fitting them to the frame. The frame is designed so that the wires wrap under the arms and come up through a hole in the arms, so this is how I mounted them. I twisted each set of motor wires to keep the wires tidy. I then mounted the flight controller to the frame. I removed the heat shrink from the ESCs as there is very little room to work on the frame, and mounted them as close to the flight controller as possible. Here I am dry fitting the ESCs so that I can cut the wires to the appropriate lengths. With all 4 ESCs mounted, I trim the motor and ESC wires. I then remove the motors and the ESCs from the frame to strip all of the wires. This makes stripping them much easier. I also use this as an opportunity to easily tin all of the wires. Next, I solder all of the ESC pads and all of the pads on the flight controller that I will be using. To solder the motors to the ESCs, I pass the motor wires through the respective armhole and connect it to an ESC. The wire order does not matter, as we can change motor direction with BL Heli. I then slide the provided heat shrink over the ESCs and shrink it down. I cut and attach some 3M extreme tape, which I'll later use to mount the ESCs to the frame. I position the motors and ESCs into place and screw the motors to the frame. I use blue Loctite on all of the screws to ensure that they won't vibrate loose. The kit supplies 2 lengths of screws for each motor. I used the shorter screws. I remove the film from the tape, mount the ESCs to the frame, and before soldering them to the flight controller, I remove it to install the Velcro strap. This is much easier than trying to feed it under the flight controller when everything is installed. I solder the ESC power wires to the PDB, taking time between each to ensure that I do not overheat the board. My PDB did not have ground pads for the signal wires, so I connected them to the respective power grounds. Finally, I solder each signal wire to its respective pad. What I was trying to show here was that I loosely assembled the camera pod to trim the camera and VTX wires to length. I disassembled the frame, tinned the wires, and soldered them to the board. I used the pigtail at the length provided. Make sure you switch to a larger tip when soldering the heavy gauge wire. I mount my receiver with foam tape, install the base plate of the camera pod, and pass the wires for the camera and VTX through the hole in the center. And finally, the last step in the build is to assemble the camera pod. That is, unless you need to disassemble the entire thing to move a single wire. Now, we can call it finished. Alright, and here's the first flight of my Hobbymate X130. I'm running an F4 flight controller on beta flight 3.1.5. The ESCs are running D-Shot 600 and gyro loop of 8 kHz and PID loop of 4 kHz. Okay, so let's see how she flies. Alright, so first thing, always check failsafe. Perfect. Check your beepers working. Okay. So I start with a line of sight just to make sure everything's flying right. So we'll give that a shot now. Alright, so it's feeling pretty good. Nice and tight. Little weak on 3S, so it's looking like 4S is going to be the way to go with this kit. But yeah, it's working pretty good. Give it a punch. Alright, let's move on to some FPV. Alright, let's give it a go. So as I mentioned, I am flying on 3S, so it looks a little weaker than it is. You're definitely going to want 4S for this. But you can see that it is flies really well. Flips are nice and tight. Wow, it's really quick on 3S. I can only imagine it'll be on 4S. Alright, let's bring it in, make sure nothing's getting too hot. All the motors feel fine. ESCs feel fine. Yeah, pretty impressed. You can see here, looking at the max current draw on the OSD, it only drew 17 amps. So that's pretty impressive. That means each motor's drawn about 4.5 amps on full throttle punch-outs. So yeah, quite impressed. Alright, so final thoughts. I really like this kit. Everything worked great out of the box. D-Shot 600 on the ESCs worked flawlessly. There was no fooling around. The motors are plenty powerful for the size of the frame. And the frame seems to be pretty durable. I had my reservations beforehand, but I had a few mild crashes with it, and there's no problems at all. You'd never even know. Now, I said during my flight that 3S wasn't really working too well on this, but that's not totally the whole story. So I was using these Zop Power 1500 milliamp. They're actually about a 1200 milliamp hour battery, but they're pretty heavy. The weight of these themselves are about the same as the quadcopter, so it wasn't really giving it a fighting chance. The fact that it performed as well as it did with these batteries shows that it is actually pretty powerful. I'm going to try a 3S 850. That should be enough. That'll cut the weight of this in half, and then it should be fine to fly. If that doesn't work, then I'll move to 4S on this build. So I would certainly recommend this quad to somebody who's looking for their first micro. I wouldn't recommend it as a first build. It is pretty tight, but if you've got a build or two under your belt, then there's nothing wrong with this one. In terms of pros and cons, I'm going to start out with the fact that this is just a partial kit. That can be a bit of a con because it's nice to get all the parts in one go and to save a bit of money on some of the components, but at the same time you usually end up getting just an SPF 3, pretty generic components in those kits. So it's nice because I was able to use a brand new flight controller in here and test out a new camera, so it was actually kind of a benefit that the kit didn't come with them. So depending on what your take is, that can be seen as both a pro and a con. As a pro, the kit is reasonably priced. As I have it built here, I'm at about $165 total, including the receiver and the VTX and the antenna and the camera. So it's quite reasonable compared to other kits, and I'm using brand new top-of-the-line equipment, so that's not bad. As far as cons go, there are a few small annoyances with the frame, as I pointed out, but other than that, there's nothing really wrong with the kit. Everything worked perfect out of the box for me. So, with that being said, I think that this is a great kit for somebody looking for their first 130 build. So I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check it out. I want to say a big thank you to Hobbymate for sending me the kit to review, though I did still purchase all the additional components myself. Alright, thanks for watching.